There have been a lot of great wrestlers in WWE over the years, and ever since SmackDown first started airing in the summer of 1999, there have been a lot of them who have found their main home there. After all, with it at points being the company's A show, it's no surprise there's frequently been a deep roster of main event talent holding down the fort on the blue brand. But who are the greatest SmackDown superstars of all time? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with the current king of the industry, Roman Reigns. Yes, there is no bigger star in wrestling today than the Tribal Chief. And ever since the Blue brand found a new home on Fox in 2019, it's been there he's set up a permanent residency. Why is that? Well, because if any wrestling show is going to be on network TV every week, reaching the biggest audience possible, then you can be damn sure the head of the table is going to make his presence felt on it. Hell, ever since making SmackDown the Bloodline show in 2020, he's been a near constant presence there, even when he's not on screen. And that's because whenever he's not on the show, he's usually there in spirit via his wise man Paul Heyman or one of his cousins in the Usos or Solo Sikoa. Of course, on the weeks he does show up though, the vibe gets taken to another level altogether as his star aura adds a whole new dimension to the proceedings and makes it appointment viewing for WWE fans. Really, at this point, it's hard to imagine a day when Roman won't be the king of Friday nights anymore, either because he heads over to Hollywood or because he's drafted back to a Netflix-helmed Raw. After all, where would the Blue brand have been these past few years had we not had matches like him going one-on-one with Daniel Bryan, or segments such as the one which saw he and the rest of the Bloodline be broken down into laughter by Sami Zayn? In a much worse place, that's for sure. Sure, you could argue it would be nice if he showed up a little more often, but this lack of him being there in person most weeks obviously hasn't hurt WWE, as they're hotter now than they have been in years. In fact, you could argue the last time they were as hot as this was back in the 90s when Roman's other cousin was holding down the fort on SmackDown. That's right, it's time to talk about The Rock. After all, the show was named after one of his most well-known catchphrases, so for that reason alone, we have to include Dwayne Johnson in a video about SmackDown's greatest superstars. But it's not just the fact the show was named after him which earns him a spot here today. No, it's also the fact that during the early days of the show back at the turn of the millennium, he, more than anyone else, was the one who helped establish it as a powerhouse on the level of Raw. And that's not to say this meant Rocky didn't appear on Monday nights too at this point, as it was before the days of the brand extension. So it wasn't uncommon to see big names like Steve Austin, Triple H, and The Undertaker appear twice a week on a regular basis. But for all the legendary moments the Great One created on Raw back then, he created even more on SmackDown. Yes, it was on the Blue brand that we saw memorable scenes such as Dwayne doing his sliding people's elbow, and of course, the memorable instant replay promo where he absolutely ethered the Big Show. And so when the first ever WWE draft happened in 2002 then, it should come as no surprise that the People's Champion was the first pick for the show, and the first pick overall. Seriously, if you're going to associate any one wrestler with this show, then it should probably be The Rock. And if you need any further evidence of this, just look to the fact that since returning to WWE in January of 2024, now as a member of the board of TKO, it's been Friday nights where he's made his presence felt as he sets up a big-time tag team bout for WrestleMania 40, pitting him and Roman Reigns against Cody Rhodes and Seth Rollins. But what about those years when the Hollywood star wasn't there? Who would take up the mantle of SmackDown GOAT during the mid to late 2000s when an era of ruthless aggression was starting to take hold within WWE? Well, there are a few possible answers to that question, one of which would be our next subject, Edge. That's right, there was a period between 2007 and 2011 when Thursday nights really were the Adam Copeland show. And that's because throughout that time, he was pretty much the undisputed ace of the Blue brand. Of course, for someone with as much talent as him, this was an easy level to reach. After all, there were few wrestlers more over than he was at that point. Need any evidence of why he was so over? Just look at the 11 world title reigns he had over the course of his first career, the majority of which came on SmackDown. And then there's the fact that with his familia by his side, he was often able to dominate entire episodes of the show, much in the same way as Roman Reigns and his bloodline do today. But even before his main event run in the mid-2000s, Edge was already establishing himself as one of the key acts of the Blue brand, as it was during the early part of that decade he became part of the famed SmackDown 6, a group of young performers who, with their endless combination of matches against one another, were for a while able to make this show the most must-watch under the WWE banner, way better than anything that was happening on the Triple H Reign of Terror-led Raw at the time. Hell, we could sit here all day listing the great bouts the Toronto native was part of on free TV back then, but that would take up the entire video. So for the sake of brevity, we'll just say that if it involved him, Rey Mysterio, Chavo Guerrero, or one of two other people we'll get to in a moment, then it was absolutely worth watching and is probably still worth going back and checking out to this day. That said, for all the great work those performers did, it was arguably Edge who had the biggest long-term impact on the brand, as even now, many people still associate him with it more than any other performer. And that's why it was so great to see him return to the show once he came out of retirement in 2020, as for those who'd watched his first run in person, it was a wave of nostalgia they thought they'd never get to feel again. But let's move on from Edge for now and talk about one of those other two unnamed members of the SmackDown 6 we alluded to a moment ago, as one of them could stake their own claim to being the GOAT of the Blue brand. Who are we talking about here? Why, Eddie Guerrero, of course. Yes, how could we not make mention of the man who, for many, is not just the greatest of all time on Tuesday or Thursday nights, but is the greatest of all time in general? Really, there is a short list of wrestlers you could legitimately call the best in-ring performer to ever do it, and Eddie would be high up on that list without a doubt. And that's what made him so beloved by SmackDown fans once he made a home there following the brand extension in 2002, with it being almost a weekly occurrence for him at this point to either deliver a great match or a killer segment. So great was he, in fact, you were probably watching just to see what Latino Heat would do every week, either as part of the SmackDown 6 or completely separate to them. Hell, once that era ended, he was still able to remain on top of the mountain when, while a member of that roster, he became WWE Champion after beating Brock Lesnar for the honor. And at that point, he only became even more beloved by fans, as everyone found it impossible to resist his roguish charms. Really, just thinking back on how great Eddie was and how much audiences were invested in what he was doing is a little painful, because we know we'll never get to see him do what he did again. But then, to not think about it would be to forget his legacy, and we certainly wouldn't want to do this either, as the son of Gory Guerrero left such a great legacy behind, primarily on the Blue brand. But let's move away from Eddie and on to the other member of the SmackDown 6 we've yet to mention now, because he also has more than earned his spot in today's video. Yes, we're talking about Kurt Angle. Now, if you want to consider Eddie Guerrero the greatest in-ring wrestler to ever do it, then we wouldn't argue with you. But in that same vein, if you wanted to say such an honor deserved to go to Kurt Angle instead, then we wouldn't argue with that either, as no one has ever taken to the sport in the way that he did so quickly and with so much unearthly levels of talent. Sure, he was already an Olympic gold medalist in amateur wrestling when he joined the Fed back in late 1999, but as we've all seen with Gable Steveson, being a great amateur and a great pro wrestler are two entirely different things. And it wasn't long after joining WWF that Kurt became one of the star attractions of SmackDown, because even before the brand extension happened, he was holding court there many weeks as the company's world champion. Then, when the rosters were formally split, he'd spend the majority of his remaining years under Vince McMahon's employ acting as a staple of Tuesday and Thursday nights, with his aforementioned encounters with the SmackDown 6 being so good they've since entered into the realm of legend. That said, it wasn't just the SmackDown 6 era which made the Olympic hero's time on the Blue brand so memorable. No, there was also the absolutely stellar feud he had with Brock Lesnar in 2003, with perhaps the peak of that whole time being the absolutely brilliant Iron Man match the pair had on the September 18th episode of the show that year, a match which still ranks among the best WWE has ever given away on free TV. And even when he wasn't able to wrestle on account of injury, he'd still be a focus of what was happening there, something his spell as SmackDown general manager proved. Really then, is there any doubt in anyone's mind that Kurt Angle is one of the GOATs of the Blue brand? Seriously, we could list off moment after moment he created there and still be at it next week. Moments such as his infamous incident with Daniel Puder, or his Sexy Kurt segment with Sherry Martel. So let's just focus on one more moment for now then, the moment he helped introduce WWE to its next franchise player back in June of 2002. A man who, as it happens, is our next subject, none other than John Cena. Come on now, did you really think we were going to do a video about the GOATs of SmackDown and not talk about Big Match John? After all, it was on the Blue brand that the biggest star of the Ruthless Aggression era and beyond first established himself as the new ace of the Fed. How did he do that? Well, during the early days at least, he did it by creating his Doctor of Thuganomics character, a character which, like with Steve Austin and The Rock before him, was initially supposed to present the West Newbury native as a heel, but only ended up getting him more over as a mega babyface in the long run. Sure, you could argue that the majority of Cena's time following this was actually spent on Raw, as after becoming the superhero-like version of himself we all know him to be now, and from there being drafted over to Monday nights in 2005, the bulk of his run would see him remain there. But never let it be forgotten that had he not had those initial few years on SmackDown with which to fully establish himself, things may have never gotten to that point. No, without John doing his famous rap on the Halloween episode of the show in 2002, all while dressed as Vanilla Ice, he likely wouldn't have reached the level he eventually did. And had it not been for him gaining big-time wins over the likes of Eddie Guerrero, The Undertaker, and Chris Benoit, all en route to eventually dethroning someone we'll get to in a moment to become WWE Champion in 2005, then it doesn't seem realistic to think he'd ever have reached the top to the same degree. Hell, even his United States title runs on the blue brand were a big part of him eventually becoming the man he'd become, as while feuding with the likes of Carlito and Booker T over this belt, he'd show himself to be more than capable of carrying a division on his shoulders when asked to do so. Yes, the truth is that if there was no SmackDown run, then there would be no Big Match John as we know him today. And that would certainly be bad news for WWE, as he's been such a major part of their programming over the last couple of decades. But what of the man he beat for the WWE title back in 2005? The man we alluded to a moment ago. Surely he deserves his own inclusion in today's video, as he's none other than JBL. Now, we know he wasn't necessarily the wrestler that Eddie Guerrero or Kurt Angle were, and he's not as good on the mic as John Cena or The Rock. But one thing John Bradshaw Layfield has over those performers is that, for a while at least in 2004 and 2005, he was the longest reigning champion the SmackDown brand had ever seen. Seriously, after shocking the world and winning the strap that was, by this point, blue brand exclusive from Eddie Guerrero at June 17, 2004's Great American Bash, he'd go on to hold the gold for a full 280 days, the longest run anyone had had with that title since the inception of SmackDown. And that alone earns him a spot in this video. But then it's more than just the length of the reign, because while holding it, he'd have some surprisingly good matches against performers such as The Undertaker, Booker T, and Kurt Angle. And whenever he wasn't lacing up his boots for the night, he was usually taking part in an entertaining segment with his cabinet, made up as they were of Orlando Jordan, the Basham brothers, and Amy Weber. Really then, considering how close he was to being on the chopping block before he morphed into this J.R. Ewing-inspired character, and from there quickly rose to the top, you could argue JBL's time on SmackDown during that period was by far and away the best thing he ever did in his career, and one of the best things the Blue brand ever saw in general. Hell, even when he lost the belt to John Cena at WrestleMania 21, the cash he'd built up for himself by then meant he'd always remain somewhere near the top of the card on Tuesday or Thursday nights for the rest of his in-ring career. Whether that meant him challenging whoever the WWE champion was at that time in order to try and win his gold back, or him helping to elevate things like the Intercontinental title during programs with Rey Mysterio or CM Punk. In fact, at one point, he'd even had a pretty good feud with our next subject, someone who, like Edge, has a strong claim to being the ace of SmackDown during its mid-2000s period. But then, when we're talking about someone like Batista, how could he not be in the running for this spot? That's right, before he became a Hollywood star in his own right, Dave Batista was the king of the Blue brand for a while, as it was there he had the lion's share of his success. Sure, things might have first started picking up for him on Raw, as it was on that show he was a member of Evolution for a while, but once his eventual era-defining feud with Triple H was over, and he was holding the World Heavyweight title above his head, he'd be moved over to the other show instead. And it's probably for the best that he was moved there in the long run then, because between 2005 and 2008, he was able to absolutely rule the roost on SmackDown by not only spending lengthy spells as world champion, but also by having some of the most memorable programs in the show's history. After all, who can forget his feuds with Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and The Undertaker? Especially when it was that latter feud which led to the birth of the mini-streak of WrestleMania Classics the Dead Man had for a while, when the two faced off at WrestleMania 23. Then, of course, there were his beefs with the likes of Booker T, The Big Show, and others. Honestly, for as bad as it was, even his time spent fighting it out with the Great Khali during the mid-2000s still has a certain air of nostalgia to it for those who remember it first airing. And if you need any evidence of the nostalgia this has created over the years, then you only have to look to the way Big Dave's Dune co-star Timothée Chalamet geeked out over meeting him for the first time on set, as he had such fond memories of watching the animal kick ass every week back when he was a kid. So there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that Batista is one of the greatest wrestlers who's ever plied their craft on SmackDown, and that no matter who comes in the future, he'll still be one of the greatest, as he was just that good and that memorable. Was he quite as good and memorable as our next subject though? Well, that's up for you to decide, because our next subject is none other than the legend, the enigma, the Undertaker. That's right, when it comes to people who are completely synonymous with the blue brand, the Undertaker has to rank highly amongst their numbers. And that's because despite being around a lot longer than SmackDown has ever existed, it still feels like so many of the big parts of his career happened there. Yes, it's true that a decent percentage of his time was spent on Raw during the Attitude Era, and it's also true that when the first draft happened, the Dead Man was actually moved to Monday nights permanently for a while. But after moving over to Thursday nights instead in 2003, it would be that show which remained his home for the rest of his full-time career. And this meant all the classic moments that came from the golden era of the streak would take place here too, including his highly memorable programs with Batista, Edge, and Randy Orton. But they weren't the only great feuds Mark Calaway was involved in the 2000s and early 2010s SmackDown, as he'd also get to lock it up with performers like Kurt Angle, Brock Lesnar, and JBL. Hell, he even managed to go head-to-head with some of the top stars of Raw in interpromotional battles during this period too, names like Shawn Michaels and Triple H. And in doing this, it meant he was always able to maintain some of the blue brand's legitimacy even as it started to slide down to the level of being a glorified Raw recap show. So never let it be forgotten that, while there may have been a whole host of big names on SmackDown over the years, many of whom we've discussed today already, they were all just playing in The Undertaker's yard. Of course, every legend has his time to ride off into the sunset though, and this is exactly what happened to the Phenom in April of 2020 at WrestleMania 36, with him there being retired by our next subject, the man who in many ways took over his mantle as Mr. SmackDown for a while, AJ Styles. Now we know he's spent a decent amount of time on Raw too, but most of the big moments the Phenomenal One has had since joining WWE in 2016 have been on Friday nights. After all, it was there he had a memorable feud with John Cena, which fully established him as a main event player in Vince McMahon's company, something even the most optimistic of fans had doubted would happen. And it was also there where he won the WWE title on 2 separate occasions. In fact, his second run with the belt was so dominating it would last for a full year, 371 days to be exact, and would see him stand toe-to-toe with the best the WWE had to offer, names like Daniel Bryan, Shinsuke Nakamura, Samoa Joe, and Brock Lesnar. So while he may be no stranger to Monday nights, if we were picking one show we most closely associated Styles with, it would be SmackDown. And that's why it's so great then that, as of April of 2023, he's returned to the blue brand once again, and is there picked up right where he left off by having bangers against folks such as Randy Orton and LA Knight. Sure, he might be in the winding down phase of his career now, the phase where his focus begins to shift more towards getting younger talent over, so there's no guarantee we'll see him hold that world title again. But even if he doesn't, he'll still go down as one of the all-time legends of SmackDown, if for no other reason than he was able to do everything he did there in only a few short years, and after he'd already passed the 40-year-old mark. But then everyone we've looked at today will go down as a legend of the brand in their own right, as they each helped to make it the A show it has become today.